Thank you for joining the Deltek Expense Report training. Before we get started, there's a few administrative items to note. The Deltek Expense Report user guide is available for download in the upper left corner of your screen. It was also included in the email that was sent out on Tuesday. If you'd like to ask a question during the session, please type it in the Q&A box that's located on the bottom left of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as possible throughout the training. The last date to submit an expense report into the current system is tomorrow, Friday, December 15th. Beginning on Monday, December 18th, all expense reports must be submitted into the new Costpoint system we're learning today. If you have questions about existing expense reports that have not been approved or processed, please send an email to the Get Expense Report team so that they can work with you to ensure it gets processed this month. Your time for this training should be charged to your overhead labor charge code, either 0601-004 or -005. And the last thing before we get started, though the system for time and expense report is changing, nothing is changing in the process regarding the types of information or documents that need to be submitted. Specific expense requirements are based upon your contract's requirements, which has not changed. If you have specific questions pertaining to your contract, your PM will be the best resource. I'd like to now introduce Ms. Chris Fitzgerald for today's presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. I hear some folks are on the West Coast, so I appreciate you getting up extra early to attend this training. Again, my name is Chris Fitzgerald, and I'm a consultant working with AFSCE on setting up the Costpoint system, which is the financial system that's going live on January 1st. Along with that, we are rolling out a new time and expense system. It's actually the same system that you're currently using. It's the Deltek Time and Expense, but it's the latest and greatest version of that system. So what we're going to do today is walk through the process of logging into the system and filling out an expense report. So what you're looking at right now on the screen that I'm sharing is the URL that you'll need to go to log into the system. You should have all received emails yesterday from the Deltek Cloud system to log you in with a new user ID and a temporary password. You'll need to log in and change your temporary password and answer security questions so you can then go in later and change your password if you need to. Once you do that, you can then log in and start filling out your timesheet or your expense report. Today's session is just going over expense reports. We will start the timesheet training next week. So once you've filled out your login information, you'll go to this URL, which will bring you to your portal. In the upper left-hand corner is where you can fill out your timesheet or your expense report. You'll click on this link here, and it brings you to the login page. Your username is a 5-digit character starting with 47161. Then there's a dot, then the letter A for AFSCE, then a dot, and then your employee ID. Your password is the password that you just set up on the cloud system, and that will be your password to both change your password information as well as to log into the system. The system, on Monday you will type in Magellan Health Config. For our purposes today, since the system is not turned on yet, I'm going to go into a test database. This is a copy of the configuration database that will look exactly the same. Down at the bottom there's a checkbox that says Remember My Login Information. If you check this checkbox, if you're on a personal computer, you can check this checkbox. The system will remember your user ID and the system. You will only have to then enter in your password. So I want to go ahead and log in the system, and it'll bring you to the time and expense screen. To get to your expense report, you'll click on Time and Expense, Expense Report, and then you have two options, either Manage Expense Reports or Printing Your Expense Reports. To fill out an expense report, you'll go to the Manage Expense Report screen. When you first enter the screen, it will bring you to the last expense report that you were working on. So you'll notice I had one here that I did yesterday for a trip to New York. to do a new expense report, you'll come up to the top of the screen, and there's a new button. If you click the new button, it refreshes the screen, brings up a new expense report. You need to fill in any required information. That is identified with a red asterisk next to the description name. So I'll just enter in a expense report that I'm going to make. The information down below that is your employee ID and your employee name, and I'm in there as a test user today. The next thing you have to do is pick the type of expense report that you're going to fill out. If I click in the field, a magnifying glass will appear. If I click on that, it'll give me the option of doing 3 different expense reports. The first option is doing all expenses, travel expenses and non-travel expenses. The second option is used for monthly mileage. If you have a monthly mileage reimbursement that you fill out once a month, you can fill it out here. Please note that this is the only expense that you can enter on this type of expense report. The last option is for non-travel expenses. You can enter a cell phone reimbursement here. You can also enter any software, hardware, any training that you do. Things like that are going to be on the non-travel expenses. So I'm going to pick a type of expense report. ASCII right now is not using the authorization piece, so that field is disabled and you can skip that. I have to enter in my from and my to date. You can either type them in or you can pick it up from the calendar. And then you've got to give it a purpose. So this is pretty similar to the way it was in the old system. Once you've completed that, you go to the Locations tab, which is located at the top of the expense report. The screen will display a new line. If you have existing locations, you can do a lookup in the location field. Magnifying glass will appear, and any frequent or favorite locations will appear here. If you haven't traveled to this city recently or ever, you can come over to the right-hand side, and I'm actually going to close down the size of my column so we can see everything. This works similar to how it works in Excel. You can grab it and just slide it over. And then you can do a lookup for the country. When the lookup appears, I'm going to pick United States. You can also type in the first letter and it will filter out those locations. Once again, the county should default in, similar to how it worked in the old T&E system. There are a few cities in the United States that share a county, so in that case you would be required to enter in the county as well. But for the most part, the county is going to default in. On the right-hand side of the screen is your frequent location checkbox. It defaults to checked, so if you go here over and over again, it'll appear in your location lookup. If this is a one-time trip, you can uncheck the checkbox, and it won't appear in your favorites. You have to select it each time. The next thing you have to fill out is the default charging information. So you have to enter in your project or your charge number. That's done in the Locations tab. I'm sorry, next to the Locations tab in the Default Charges tab. Here I'll do a lookup as well. And you have to pick the project that you were working on. This will work a little bit differently than it does now because you're moving to the Costpoint financial system, and it's a more expanded project structure. So I'm going to pick a project. here that sync is active. And you'll notice I'm clicking several times to get down to the charging level of the project. The hint that I give folks is to keep pressing the plus sign until you come to a spot that doesn't have it, and that's your charging level. Once you pick your project, hit the select button, and that'll add it to your expense report. You have the option of adding it to your favorites. There's a button above the table where you can add it to your favorites, similar to how it works on your timesheet. You can also add multiple projects onto the expense report. To do that, you'll come up to the right-hand side of the screen and press the New button, and that'll add a row to the expense report. On the right-hand side of the table, there's a default allocation percentage. If you have more than one project, the total of the two projects has to equal 100%. So you may split them 50-50 or 75-25, but your total has to equal 100% before you can save the expense report. And speaking of saving the expense report, you can do that at any point. That's located in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. You have two options here. You have a save and a save and continue. Save is on the left-hand side, and save and continue is just to the right of that. By pressing the save and continue, it will keep you on this expense report. So once I've saved it, now I'm going to add some expenses onto my expense report. So for those of you that are following on the PowerPoint slide, we are currently on page 14. So to add an expense onto the expense report, you'll come into the middle of the expense report. It's called the Claimed Expenses section. Again, I'll hit the New button, which is located on the right-hand side of the screen. And the first thing I have to do is pick a category. And we've organized these categories a little bit to hopefully make it a little bit easier to pick the type of expense that you have to fill out. I'm going to start with a transportation expense. The next thing I have to do is go to the next field, which is the expense type field, and pick the specific type of transportation expense. You'll notice we have airfare and baggage fee, booking fee, mileage, parking. Anything that has to do with transportation is located in this section. I'll select airfare to begin. And at the bottom of this screen, you'll notice there's some other information. There's location, there's a provider field, short description. This information will either default in or it's not required by AFSCME, so it's grayed out. You won't be able to modify it. The next thing you have to do is enter in how much you spent on that expense. So I'll go to the Amount tab and fill out that information. The first thing you have to decide is the payment method, which is how you paid for this expense. The lookup contains two options, either company paid or employee paid. Company paid are used for those expenses that were paid for by the BTA card or the, what is it called, NC? BTA card. Yeah, travel agent booking.
Agencia.
Agencia, thank you. The Agencia booking agency. So even though you may not get reimbursed for those expenses, you still have to enter them onto the expense report. The other option, of course, is employee paid. If you paid for this with your own credit card or another form of payment, you can pick employee paid. I have to enter in how much I paid for this expense. In the expense incurred field. So the next thing that you have to do is identify whether or not this expense is billable or non-billable. So to do that, you'll go into the Charge Allocations Under Ceiling link located at the bottom of the expense report. it opens up a further section down at the bottom of the expense report where you can then pick the charge type. And the options for this one are either airfare, or in this case, ferry or rail, which is direct or billable, or non-billable airfare. And then I'll save the expense report. Are there any questions before I move on? Looks like there are.
Yes. How do they know which category their project is in?
So the category is used for the specific type of expense that you're filling out. So if you're traveling for your client or for your customer, you may have airline tickets and car rental and lodging, meals, and so forth. Those are the categories, and those are the expense types. So you may have one trip that contains many of those different expenses that may all be charged to your one client.
And just for everybody's awareness, your charge codes that are specific to the project that you charge to will be loaded into your profile for you. Is that true?
That answers the question. You'll find your project codes, they'll already be loaded in for you. Can you provide an example of a non-billable airfare?
Sure. So you would work with your project manager, and it's very specific to certain projects that are happening, but you would know. So unless you are told otherwise, your airfare is going to be billable. And just a little recorrection, so I was mistaken. Your project codes are not necessarily going to be loaded individually, and Chris can kind of speak to what that structure looks like.
Sure. Yeah, while they're not loaded for you, you are limited in what you can see, so that'll limit the types of or the specific projects that you can pick. It's based on what you are authorized to charge. From there, if you save it to your favorites, it'll be auto-loaded for you, or auto-available for you. Any other questions?
Where do they log their mileage?
So we can fill out a mileage expense next. We can walk you through that.
There was also a question, I believe, on the chat about whether the detailed locations feature would reflect accurate expenses for per diem and hotel expenses. And I wanted to confirm for any of the CONUS travel, the GSA rates should be reflected. For any of our OCONUS rates, it will reflect the Department of State. And that will be updated as the fiscal year changes, which I believe changes October 1 of every year.
Yep. Yes, those new rates have actually been loaded into the system. We had a question on mileage expenses. So I'll go into the category field here. Under my transportation category, I'll pick an expense type, and there's one here called mileage. Now for mileage, the current mileage rate is 53.5 cents per mile. The system has been loaded with that information. So you just have to enter in the number of miles that you traveled. And then you have to enter in, the system will enter in the amount for you. It'll automatically calculate that for you. So for this particular expense, I'm not going to go down here and pick the under ceiling. I want you to see the error that will come up and show you how you can fix that. So I'll hit the save. You'll notice at the bottom, I have an error. It says the expense charge type is required. So by me having just told you, you know to go here to this under the charge allocations under ceiling link. But you can also click on the error, and it will take you right where you need to go. It highlights it in red. I'll pick my mileage charge type, and then I can save it. And the error will go away. Another expense that we're going to go through is the lodging expense. So I'll go to my category, I'll do a lookup, and here I have another category called lodging. And then I'll go to the expense type, and I'll pick my expense type of lodging as well. Now, lodging has changed quite a bit from the old system. In the old system, you had the option of entering in a daily room rate and a daily tax rate. And that became difficult when the room rate and the tax rate changed on a day-to-day basis. So the system was modified to have you enter in the total amount of the expense, on this screen. The next tab is for room rates that you enter in. And you notice it breaks it out by day. So I have to enter in how much I spent for each day on for room and each day on tax. And I can copy that rate down by just doing Control-C and Control-V like you would in an Excel spreadsheet. If you happen to have any personal nights, we got this question yesterday, when someone would charge a personal night on their hotel bill. If you stay at a location for let's say 2 weeks, but over the weekend was personal, you can enter in the full amount that shows up on your hotel bill on the Amount tab. And then in here, it'll ask you to list out every day. You'll mark those weekend days as personal. I'll do the same thing. I'll come into my charge allocation under ceiling and pick my lodging charge type. And then I'll save my expense report. Any questions?
How do you add tolls and parking fees on mileage reimbursement?
So that's a separate expense type. So what I'll do is I'll come here into the new, I'll do a new expense. And I believe it's under transportation. Let me double check. It's for tolls, correct? Parking and tolls? Okay. So parking and tolls is here. If, for some reason, you picked the wrong category, you can always go back in and delete it and relook it up. So parking and tolls, I'll select that. Again, the next thing you have to fill out is the amount, so I'll go to the Amount tab. And I'll enter in how much I spent on parking or how much I spent on tolls. And now I have one question for the group. Are receipts required for tolls? Okay, so you are required to enter in a receipt for tolls as well as for parking. Save it now. I got this finished up. Now I've entered in quite a few different types of expenses, and right now I can only see one on my expense report. To see all of them, you come to the middle section under the claimed expenses. Over on the right-hand side, there's a button called Table. If you click on the table, it puts it into what's called a table view. If you look over to the right-hand side right now, it now says Form. What that means is you can highlight one row, and it'll put it back into that form view that we were just looking at. You could enter in expenses the same way in a table view. I personally find it easier to do it in a form view so you can see everything laid out on the screen at one time. But this will show you how much you spent for the entire trip. Now my expense incurred isn't typically located here. You can grab the column and you can move it around. So what I always do is I lay out my screen the way I want it, and then I save this layout. To do that, in the upper right-hand corner, there's a man icon. If you click on that, towards the bottom, about 2/3 of the way down, there's a current application layout. If you click the Save button, That'll save how you have it laid out. So the next time you log in, it'll look exactly the same. So the next thing I'm going to do is add my attachment onto my expense report. In this version of the expense system, you can add multiple PDF files to one expense report. You can still add one PDF if they contain all your expenses, but you have the option of adding multiple if you need to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one for my airline ticket, and the attachment link is located underneath that claimed expenses in the lower right-hand corner. There's an attachment link. And that brings up a new row. Underneath that, I'll click the new button. It opens up the row. The first thing I have to do is select an attachment type. The second column in. I'll do a lookup, and it's going to be my receipts. Of course, if you're missing a receipt, you have to give a reason. You can type that in here. Further over on the right-hand side, there's an Upload Attachment button. If I click on that, it brings up a dialog box where I can pick my file. Go in and find my receipt. I'm going to hit the Upload button. And you'll know that it uploads when the file name appears. At this point, I can also view this receipt. If I click on this View Attachment, and I open it, there's my receipt. So this is useful for both employees and supervisors to make sure they've attached the correct receipt onto the expense report. Now I can also attach attachments after I've submitted the expense report. So that's totally up to you. If you have it and you want to do them all at one time, you can do it as you do each expense. You can also do it after you submit it. So when you're ready to submit the expense report, you'll go to the top of the expense report, in the top section. On the left-hand side, you'll hit the Submit button. And you can see I got an error that said I had to save my changes. The system wants me to save the receipt that I just added. I'll hit Save, and then I'll hit Submit. And a message will pop up. This will depend on your browser, the way it looks specifically, whether you're using Internet Explorer or Chrome. It looks a little bit different. Same wording, but the view may look a little bit different. And I'll hit OK. And the status in the upper right-hand corner will then become, it will change to Submitted. At this point, your supervisor is notified that you have an expense report that's ready for approval. So if it's after you've submitted the expense report and you now need to add receipts, you'll come down here into this workflow section. The workflow, let me close this message, also gives you the listing of what needs to be done and who can do it. So I have some receipts that are still pending. Find the one for mileage, or find the one for lodging. I can again upload my attachment file. So I have a few more attachments that are due. So once that's done, the supervisor will get a notification that it's ready for approval. And we'll go over the supervisor process. I believe it's next week. We have training sessions for the supervisor. Any questions?
Will the system calculate the exchange rate for U.S. if the expenses were in euros, for example?
So this is going to be consistent with our previous system, unfortunately, because conversion rates change on a daily basis. That's something that we're going to keep with the old process, which is to ensure that you are entering the U.S. dollar conversion and for the date of expense, and that you include a printout of whatever conversion rate you utilize. The website that we encourage you to use, because it's consistent with what we'll be checking with, is owanda.com, and we can ensure that it is included in a communication now.
Do they still have to upload their actual flight itinerary with the receipts?
So flight itineraries are a per project requirement. We will need receipts regardless of company paid or employee paid, but if it is a project requirement per your program to upload itineraries, nothing will change. So no new requirement, but no stripping of old requirements. Everything stays the same.
If they go over per diem amount for lodging, how is that processed?
Right. So let me show you that. We actually had this question yesterday. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete out my lodging expense, and I'm going to re-add it. So we haven't talked about deleting yet. So if you go under the claimed expenses section, I have my list of all my different expenses. I'm going to highlight the one I want to delete by marking it on the left-hand side. It'll change that color to blue. And then in the upper right-hand corner of that table, there's a delete button. And you'll notice it marks it with a little X next to the row. Sorry, it's the wrong new. Put it back into form view. I'll pick my lodging category. And off the top of my head, I'm just going to say that $1,000 is probably over per diem. I'm not sure what Anaheim, California has for the lodging amount, but we'll say that $1,000 is probably over what the per diem rate is. Again, I have to enter in how much I spent for each night for room and for tax. Probably not going to be enough. I thought I had 4 days. My apologies. So, because you have to pick whether it's billable or not, I'll go into my charge type, and I'll pick my direct lodging. And you'll notice, find it here, find it. We had been going into this charge allocation under ceiling link for all of these expenses. There's another one over here to the right called the charge allocation over ceiling link. If I click on that, it will automatically put in my over ceiling amount, or over ceiling charge information. And let's say, for example, it was only a few dollars that you couldn't bill. To do that, I can allocate either by amount or by percentage. So first I have to identify which I'm going to do. So here I have the option of doing it by amount. I went into the charge allocation under ceiling link again. I can change it to amount. Now the amount is highlighted. I can modify this. Same thing. I can go into the charge allocation over ceiling link, and I can change that as well. Please note the total amount of the expense has to equal how much, that $1,000. Any other questions?
So for the individuals that are on the line, please note that if you ever go over per diem, that must be approved by your project manager. We understand that oftentimes there are locations without availability within the per diem rate. You just need to run that by your PM prior to going ahead and engaging with those charges.
For monthly mileage expenses, Do they need to create a day-by-day mileage, or can they enter the total mileage per se on the last day of the month?
Nothing will change with regard to your monthly mileage, so however you are doing it now is how your clients would like to see those reports. So it is per project, but however you're doing it now is the way you should go forward with it.
And like we had mentioned earlier, for the monthly mileage, I'm going to save my expense report. I didn't do very good math, so what I'm going to do is get out of the system, get back in, so you can see that mileage expense report. So this monthly mileage that was added, you'll notice down here, if I go in the middle section under the claimed expenses section, my category, I only have mileage. My expense type links to that, I only have mileage. So these are only for those folks that do a monthly mileage expense report and don't have any other expenses. If you do happen to have other expenses, you can fill out one of the other expense reports as well.
Do they need to combine all receipts into one PDF document, or can they upload several?
You can upload several. It really is up to you. You can have individual PDF files for each expense. You can have one PDF file for all of your expenses, or any combination of that. If you have some expenses that have two expenses, for example, on one PDF and three expenses on another, you can upload two files and link those expenses in.
And do they need to be PDF?
Right now the system is configured to do just PDFs. If you're looking to add other types of files, JPEG files or GIF or GIF files, we can talk through that and potentially add that as well.
We have been told previously to just enter the max per diem amount per night on the expense report because it's easier. Can we not do that any longer?
Is that for room or for meals? I'm sorry, yeah, for lodging or for meals? Do we know?
Lisa, can you provide some clarification on that question?
So for
lodging.
Okay, yeah. So for meals, you are reimbursed at the per diem rate. So for lodging,
you want to enter your actuals, and you want to separate those out with your taxes that are listed separately, but not the max. Definitely actuals.
Under location, does this allow us to more accurately identify the GSA rates for our various stops along our route when we're on a long trip, for example, if they're going on various stops?
So on the expense report, you can add as many locations as you need to. The system will allow you to add as many as you need, and it will use those dates that you enter to determine the per diem amount for both meals and for lodging.
Okay, I think that's all of the questions for right now.
Okay.
There's one that says, what if mileage is being billed as a larger expense report? I do believe we added the capability of doing a separate just for mileage, but you can enter your mileage as a part of a larger trip the same way you would enter any expense. That is not a separate process.
Yep, that is correct. You'll notice on the expense report that I'm viewing right now, within that expense report, I have airfare, mileage, and parking.
And another question about per diem. Do we still calculate the per diem for where they're sleeping at night? For example, you work all day in one location but drive to the next, and that's where you're staying the night.
So that's a good one. We've heard a couple different ways for doing that, so we'll definitely get you out some additional information because we understand that individuals have multi-leg trips. Some individuals, and what we've gone with in the past, has been where you rest your head at night is where your per diem is going to be based. But we'll get definitive answers on that just because we've had a little bit of a varied response to that recently, and let you all know so you have that as part of our FAQs.
And also, just so you know, we're providing 5 or 6 different training sessions, and we're compiling all of the questions from those sessions, and we'll distribute out one document with both the questions and the answers. Okay. So a couple other things I wanted to show you on the expense report is when I first logged into the expense report, I said that it brings me to the current expense report that I was working on, or the last expense report. And let's say you wanted to look at an expense report that was done 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it's not the most current one that you're working on. To do that, you want to query your expense report. So I'm in the expense report screen. In the upper right-hand corner, there's a query button. Brings up a dialog box, and if you know the expense report ID, you can enter it here. If you don't, you can simply hit Find, which is located at the bottom of the screen, and it will bring up all of your trips or all of your expenses that you filled out. Then you can highlight the one that you want to look at, and at the bottom of the screen will show your claimed expenses. And you can modify any expense reports as long as they haven't been processed. If the expense report has been approved, you will need to resubmit it, and it will need to go through a reapproval. So when you're done filling out the expense report, you may want to print it. So to print the expense report, I'm back at the main screen. I'll go under Time and Expense, Expense, and then Expense Reports, and then Print Expense Report. And this screen defaults in with all the checkboxes checked. So depending on what you're looking for, if you have all your expenses are submitted, you may want to uncheck some of those checkboxes. The functional role for most folks will just be the word self. If you happen to be a supervisor, you can print an expense report for one of your employees. The functional role will also contain the option of doing a primary supervisor. The report type are the different types of expense reports that are available. You can see the 3 that are listed here, or you can pick all of them. You can also filter it by the name, by the expense report ID, and then the expenses authorization ID. Again, we're not using that for AFSCME, so you can ignore that option. Once you've made your selections, you go to the top of the screen. There's a bunch of icons at the top. There's a print preview, which is actually located in between the printer icons. The one to the right of that is the print icon. So if you have a reason to print the expense report, you would print it from here. Close out some of these screens. Now, some of you may have some expense reports that are outstanding, that you started them, but you may have forgotten about them. So you can either query for them, like we just went through, to find the expense reports that you have, or you can find them from your desktop. To get to your desktop, that's under this configuration option here. If you go to Resources, then you go to Manage My Desktop. This will list out all of your expense reports and their status, or what you need to do for it. In this case, all of mine are in white status, which means they aren't overdue. The same options appear here as on the old desktop, where if it's yellow, it means it's more urgent, and red is a very urgent status that needs to be completed. But if you're on your desktop, you can click on the expense report that you want to look at or modify. And again, you've highlighted it by selecting it blue in the left-hand corner. Then you go down to the middle section here on the right-hand side. There's a Launch button. If you hit Launch, it'll take you right to that expense report. Are there any questions about querying or printing or going to the desktop or anything else?
I have other questions for you.
Okay.
How do they annotate shipboard meals?
So we have an expense that we're adding specifically for shipboard meals. We've had some discussions as far as what the rate was. There are over 400 ships in the Navy, so we couldn't add those as specific per diem locations. So we're in the process of working through the details of how to add that. But you will have an option in the meals category to enter in shipboard meals as well.
And while we're working through that process, I would just advise as best practice, the more detail, the better you can provide with regard to those shipboard meals, so that it makes it easier for the reviewer and there's no question on our end. But if you do have questions about that, you can feel free to send a message to getexpensereport@afc.com while you're filling those out.
Okay. What is the website address for them to access the new Deltek?
So the portal address, I'm bringing up my Word document that contains it, make it a little bit bigger here. So it's showing on the screen, and I'll read it off for those that don't have access to the monitor. It's https:// and then www.deltekenterprise.com/Magellan Health /portal.html. And I believe this link went out also in communications, so if you didn't get it here, we should have an email that would come out and give you that information as well.
This may be project specific, but this person is traveling to ride the USS Wasp back, and they've been told that they get an additional bonus for 14 days at sea. How would that be recorded in the expense report?
So what we're specifically talking about is an R&R bonus, and those are not handled via the expense report system, and your project manager will handle that for you via other methods. So don't worry about putting that bonus information within the expense report.
The username was unusual and long. How can they change the username to something they can remember?
So unfortunately, AFC right now is hosted by Deltek, and the first 5-digit code is the way that Deltek identifies each company. So the 5-digit code is a requirement. The rest of the ID, the A and then dot, your employee ID, we had to do it that way because of the number of employees and the potential of having the same name. So unfortunately, that is what it is.
But they can save their sign-in, correct?
Correct, yep.
So
Yep.
if you enter it correctly, there should be a box for you to select to save those credentials.
Yep. Like we had talked about earlier, let me log out of here. At the bottom of the screen, there's a checkbox that says remember login information. So once you log that in, as long as you're not on a public computer, it will remember the username and password, or sorry, username and the in the system. The password you will still need to enter.
Another project-specific question. Are they still putting rental car insurance as non-billable items for sites when they're overseas?
So this is a great question, and I actually handle our insurance here at the corporation for those types of expenses. It's a little bit murky because it's per client. There's not specific guidance from the government on whether or not that is billable or non-billable. I've worked with the billing teams, and I think we should make the switch to try and push these through as billable, because you definitely need to have the insurance when you're OCONUS, because a lot of personal policies, I'm sure the individual with assets understands that your personal policy will likely not cover rental insurance accidents. So I would say go ahead and let's start claiming them as billable, and if we have invoices to the government which are rejected, we will change course of direction. But I think that is a cost that we can capture. So we can go ahead and, for overseas, for OCONUS travel only, I think that's fine to move that to billable.
I believe that was the last question. So if anybody does have any questions, please go to the website,
getexpensereport@afsc.com. And if you have any inquiries about a specific expense report, it is exceptionally helpful if you have the expense report number in the subject line, as well as include a phone number in the bottom of your message so that we can reach out to you. Obviously, if you're in an OCONUS location, we'll do the best to communicate with you over email. And then just a quick reminder, because we have released the BTA card, we are looking for individuals to make sure that they are separating out that booking fee. There is a specific location within the expense report system to select that as an expense type. And then if you are booking via the BTA, which is through Agencia, which is company paid, we want you to always be claiming that as company paid within the expense report so the company can receive the full reimbursement for the expenses that have been paid. With receipts also, always receipts for all of those costs, even if you didn't personally pay for them.
And just remember that you must have any expense report in and submitted by tomorrow, December 15th, in order for it to be processed through the old T&E system. This new system will be up on Monday, December 18th.
And just a quick reminder on those December 18th expenses once you enter. Once you load into the December 18th system, there's going to be a couple cycles while we're ironing out things and loading everything on the expense side. So just make sure that if you can get it in by tomorrow, please do. Otherwise, there's going to be about 3 weeks from the next time we make a payout on any expense reports.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Have a good day.